This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everyone. This is Jennifer, the programming chair of Icata, and we're here with Marta Arnaldi, and she has a wonderful project called Translating Illness, and she did a short series called Translating COVID-19, and she's going to share this research with us today. We are recording, so if you don't want anyone to hear your voice ever, I would stay muted. And yeah, we're going to get started. So I will turn it over to Marta.
Thank you, Jennifer, for your kind introduction and invitation. And thank you to each one of you for being here today. So in this talk, I would like to align my main research project, Translating Illness, and its sister project, Translating COVID-19. So given the theme of this year's Translation Day, Finding the Words for a Word in Crisis, I have decided to link this presentation to ideas of crisis prevention, management and mitigation in an attempt to appraise translation's role during and after the time of crisis we are currently living. This is a recent new dimension of my research, so I apologize in advance for the fragmentary nature of these thoughts, and I feel very privileged indeed to be able to share these preparatory ideas with you and would welcome any suggestions and questions at the end. So the talk is divided into two parts. In the first part, we'll offer some theoretical consideration on the interplay of work between translation and crisis. The second part will be a personal account of my recent research experience. I hope that one or both of these parts will resonate with your own work and interests, and that these seemingly unrelated halves, research and experience, theory and practice, will translate from and into one another to provide a vision of translation as a language of crisis. So Jennifer, if you could kindly show the slide with the references, thank you. So I will mention some of these critiques and works during the presentation so that these references are there for you for your information. So let's begin with the first part then. Human beings live in a constant state of risk. Crises, emergencies, and disasters happen simultaneously in different parts of the world and at the same time have punctuated history. As Sharon O'Brien and Federico Federici have put it, crises can erupt within cities, a region, a nation, or across borders between multiple countries, end quote. This is true, for instance, in the case of transnational contagion. The outbreak of coronavirus disease has revealed to us a series of complex, sometimes paradoxical facts, and I will list some of these facts here. First, the pandemics are built upon paradigms of global exchange and migration whereby they perpetuate themselves. Second, them being transnational, pandemics have a multilinguistic as well as a fundamentally medical dimension. Third, the pandemics are perceived and dealt with differently across different countries, just like different languages mobilize different sets of words and metaphors to describe contagion. And the fourth point is, obviously, the pandemics are a medical crisis at its extremes, so they represent an extreme case of medical crisis. And I really do not want to overestimate pandemics' cultural dimension at the expenses of the medical urgency. What I would like to do instead is to achieve an integrated vision of pandemics as biocultural phenomena. As I have written in the abstract for this talk, the word crisis is etymologically and emblematically linked to the medical sphere, meaning the turning point of a disease in late Middle English. A crisis represents for the patient the opportunity to either get worse or heal. Translation, as I will argue today, captures this moment of decisive transformation. Now, given these premises, pandemics have severe implications for temporary and long-term residents with limited proficiency in the language of the country in which they find themselves to live. I think, for example, of migrants, students, but even travelers. For them, the crisis triggered by the coronavirus pandemic has immediately cascaded into multiple crises of different nature, temporal, cultural, linguistic, and geographical, for instance. To put it simply, these populations have been unable to return to their home countries as local universities, shops, in fact entire cities locked down in the darkest months of the pandemic. So together with medically vulnerable people, I would say that foreign speakers are fragile too. Over-reliance on English as a lingua franca in multicultural countries such as the UK, the US, and I'm still quoting from O'Brien and Federici, delays engaging with the perennial issue of crisis communication among international responders and with crisis-affected communities, end quote. The coronavirus pandemic has highlighted, if not exacerbated, this issue. Translation provides a language or a range of languages with which to articulate these and other experiences of crisis. In this talk, we will try and ask ourselves how. So before applying the notion of crisis translation to the case of coronavirus disease, I would like to consider briefly with you 3 aspects of the translation crisis nexus: communication, vulnerability, and time. As I will point out in this talk, these 3 elements are co-present and interact in any translation crisis scenario. Let's start with the first, communication. A situation of crisis or emergency can sometimes be a matter of life or death. I think, for instance, of safety instructions given on an airplane or of commands given in German in a multilingual concentration camp. And now I would like to share with you 2 extracts from Primo Levi's If This Is a Man, which is a memoir written by the author himself about his experience at Auschwitz. Then, for the first time, we notice that our language lacks the words to express this offense, the demolition of a man. Suddenly, with almost prophetic intuition, the reality was revealed to us. We have reached the bottom. It is not possible to sink lower than this. A more miserable human condition is unthinkable. Nothing is ours anymore. They have taken our clothes, our shoes, our hair too. If we speak, they will not listen. And if they listen, they will not understand. They will take away even our name. And if we want to keep it, we will have to find in ourselves the strength to do so, that behind the name, something of us as we were, remains. And this is the second quotation from the same book. The confusion of languages is a fundamental component of the manner of living down here, in the lager. One is surrounded by a perpetual babel in which everyone shouts orders and threats in languages never before heard, and war on whatever fails to swiftly grasp the meaning. Nobody has time here, nobody has patience, nobody listens to you. So on an immediate basis, translation enables the flux of vital information across speakers of different languages. This is all the more important given the situations of crisis, including experiences of illness, risk, pain, and trauma, given the fact that this situation not only resists the language, but actively destroys it. These are the words of Helen Scarry, who, in her seminal 1985 book, The Body in Pain, defined the linguistic resistance of the suffering body as the shattering of language. So on a metaphorical level, translation helps us put into words the inexpressible, thus facilitating the epistemic journey from the unknown to the known. If it is true that language is one of the instruments that enables us to know the world, to get access to its meanings, then we need to have access to and hold this tool. And this leads us to the second aspect of the translation crisis link, which is vulnerability. In contexts of crisis, we tend to adopt selfish behaviors and forget the needs of others for whom the same crisis may even have a more serious impact. As Donald O'Matuna and Matthew Hunt have noticed, and I quote, "Without adequate communication, people in crisis may be unable to communicate their needs and other local knowledge effectively, and those with resources may be unable to direct their distribution efficiently and justly." End quote. For example, and I'm still using this material from Hunt and Matuna, the response to the 2014-2016 Ebola virus disease outbreak in West Africa demonstrated many communication failings and shortcomings. Bastide reports that at least in the early stages, many of the delays and inefficiencies could be traced to communication problems. In humanitarian crisis, information is gold. But in this Ebola crisis, communication about the local context broke down, resulting in strategies based on biased and inaccurate assumptions. So, as we all know, coronavirus disease has affected vulnerable populations in an extremely acute way. But has translation been counted as a possible means of prevention and mitigation of the perhaps avoidable risks to which these populations have been exposed? This, I think, is an urgently ethical question. French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who died in 2005, has combined his double concern for ethics and translation under the expression hospitalité langagière, or linguistic hospitality. Language is a refuge. Language, I would say, is a clinic. People need to understand in order to heal. To put it in legal rather than medical terms, people have the right to understand, and we are responsible for other people's chances of cure. The third element of the translation crisis that I would like to explore with you is time. The time of translation is very peculiar, is idiosyncratic, syncretic, and performative. It happens in the here and now. It requires an urgent response, and yet it is anchored in the past and projected onto the future. Critic Homi Bhabha has sketched this condition of temporal translation in an evocative way. And again, I have two quotes from his book, The Location of Culture, which I think encapsulate the nature of time in translation. This is the first one. The borderline work of culture, which for Homi Bhabha happens in the so-called first phase of translation, creates a sense of new as an insurgent act of cultural translation. Such art renews the past, prefiguring it as a contingent in-between space that innovates and interrupts the performance of the present. The past-present becomes part of the necessity, not the nostalgia, of the living. And this is the second quote. It is the cutting edge of translation and negotiation, the in-between space that carries the burden of meaning of culture, of the meaning of culture. By exploring this third space, we may elude the politics of polarity and emerge as the others of ourselves. And of course, these words by Bhabha are reminiscent of Julia Kristeva's work, seminal volume, Strangers to Ourselves. So Bhabha's ethically oriented discourse goes further as he states that minorities, be them migrant populations or women, for instance, live in crisis, or if one prefers, live in translation. Their fluid identity and migratory bodies form the fluctuant confines of the translatory nation. So, with these theoretical principles in mind, summarized by the key ideas of communication, vulnerability, and time, and I would like to move on to the second part of the talk, in which I will discuss my ongoing projects. I hope that this theoretical overview, inspired by the emerging discipline of crisis translation, will offer an imaginative space rather than a rigid scholarly framework to host the personal account that I am about to give. So let me recall here the image of a film that stayed in my memory. The 1919 film Sliding Doors, directed by Peter Howitt and starring actress Gwyneth Paltrow, follows two parallel storylines, showing the divergent paths the protagonist's life could take depending on whether or not she catches a train. In the past months, I have been haunted by the realization that we, just like this character, are continuously asked to make a choice between the real and the virtual, the vigilant and the impulsive, the rational and the absurd. The outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic has certainly diverted our journey, but is there an evident response to this crisis, to this digression? Is there a right train? As a former student of medicine and a scholar of comparative literature, I have always been fascinated by the ways in which the physical and the mental worlds interact with and shape one another. Translation is a vital vector of this exchange. We translate to replicate ourselves, protect our life, and communicate to people who could not otherwise understand or being understood. Sometimes, through the invisible paths of contagion and trauma, translation can even make us heal. This is how and why I've asked myself what different concepts and practices of translation have to do with one another, and to what extent the translation in the scientific sense, and I think here about translation of medicine or knowledge translation, so to what extent scientific translation is different to the way in which we relate to a foreign language. I created Translating Illness to explore these ideas. Supported by a Lamming Research Fellowship at the Queen's College, University of Oxford, this interdisciplinary project was awarded a double grant from Wellcome Institutional Strategic Support Fund and OUP Oxford John Fell Fund. So these grants allow me to promote, alongside primary research on modern poet translators, a series of research with public engagement activities. In October 2019, I was a writer in residence at the University of Jyväskylä, Finland, where I delivered the masterclass in creative writing in the foreign language, which for me and for the students was English. In January 2020, I inaugurated an Oxford-based seminar series, which was turned into podcast episodes. And you can listen to them on the Oxford University website. And on 1st of March 2020, I took a plane for New York in order to undertake research at Columbia University. Things, however, went differently. As alarming news were coming from China and my home country, Italy, I came to terms with the fact that my project was no longer a theoretical matter. It was, in fact, an articulation of the global crisis we were living through. Coronavirus disease had become the illness we were asked to translate. Jennifer, if you could show the webpage, that would be very kind. Thank you. I am going to show you the website where you can get access to the project I'm about to present. If you could scroll one more down, it should be the first episode. Yes, thank you so much. So I activated Translating COVID-19, which is what you're about to see, as an emergency response to the pandemic. I designed and hosted a series of 5 video conversations with world-leading experts in translation studies and epidemiology, with the aim to discuss the translational implications of coronavirus disease. The episodes touched upon questions of race, conspiracy, and lack of medical evidence connected with public health, ethnic, and environmental crisis. So in the first episode, Nicola Gardini, which you can see in the image, professor of Italian and comparative literature at Oxford, invited us to reflect on the language we use and the metaphors we resort to in order to capture the ineffability of illness. Gardini's contribution explores questions of communication and communicability from the perspective of a humanities scholar and an artist who interrogates our responses to risk and our ways of knowing, thus providing original insight into the first element of the translation crisis nexus. If you could scroll one up, thank you. The second episode in the series featured Charles Fosdick, Jane Sparrow Professor of French at Liverpool, and HRC Theme Leadership Fellow for Translating Cultures. Professor Fosdick highlighted the ways in which translation creates connections that can protect us from isolation, both on public and private levels. He explored the meanings the experience of confinement has taken across different linguistic, societal, and ethnic contexts, thus tackling issues of mental illness, class, and race. A similar attention towards non-dominant languages and cultures has characterized Professor Karen Tormes' contribution. If you can move on, please, Jennifer. Thank you. Which disclose the role literature in translation plays in retrieving examples of non-Anglo-Euro-American medical practices. Karen Thornwer, who is Harry Tuchman Living Professor in Literature and Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University, proposed a solution to the health, environmental, and racial issues gripping our society by presenting a model of global healing. My interviews with both Thornwer and Fosdick dealt with translation's nucleus of vulnerability in different yet connected ways. They both presented translation as a fundamental tool of social justice. A correct use of this instrument can improve both medical prevention and treatment. In the fourth episode, so this is another one, thank you. I dialogued with Eivind Engebretsen, Professor of Interdisciplinary Health Sciences at the Institute of Health and Society, University of Oslo. Professor Engebretsen offered the perspective of a scientist invested in humanities research that is not secondary but fundamental to clinical advancements. Engebretsen pointed out that medical discoveries, policy and practices are culturally determined. Despite our common perceptions, science does not provide universal truth, and this is particularly evident in the case of face masks. The final episode, and this is the last one, Jennifer, thanks, investigated the transnational path of contagion seen through the lens of 20th century cinema. Kirsten Oster, the founder and director of the Medical Humanities Program and the Medical Futures Lab at Rice University, Texas, drew on her expertise as a media scholar, health researcher, and technology analyst to discuss the visual culture's paradoxical power to represent the invisibility of infection. These two final episodes of the series analyze the time of translation and translation's time in relation to issues of space, mobility, and efficiency, and invited us to look at translation outside the usual parameters. So, as these overviews proves, sometimes we have no control over which train to take. What we can do is at least to try and decide how and why to wander. Translating COVID-19 has been the project of and on a crisis, conducted during a crisis. It made me travel to unspecified destinations on a train I did not plan to catch, but on which I was not alone. This work has shown us the many ways in which we, as humanists, can act as medics in the face of the unknown, thus mitigating the cascading disasters that underpins the current crisis. In advocating the importance of translation in context of crisis, I am wary of the scarcity of resources following a pandemic and many competing demands. Omasuna and Hunt have observed that questions abound, and I'm quoting here, as to how these services should be provided, and such questions lead to challenging decisions related to distributive justice. How should translation services be prioritized relative to other services during a crisis? Do these priorities change as a crisis develops and continues through different phases? How should organizations budget their limited human and financial resources towards translation? End quote. So these questions require profound attention and complex answers. And yet, the importance of addressing such challenges ethically may be missed if translation is viewed as a mere transfer of meaning between two languages. To our surprise, translation is still a foreign land, whose medical horizons have remained largely unexplored. Now I would like to conclude by reading two passages from one of my favorite books, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, by Vietnamese-American writer Ocean Vuong. This is a novel, for those of you who don't know it, that comes in the form of a letter written in English to the narrator's mother, who does not speak the language. It is both an elegy and celebration of translation's healing power at times of crisis. Our mother tongue, then, is no mother at all, but an orphan. Our Vietnamese, a time capsule, a mark of where your education ended, ashed. Ma, to speak in your mother tongue is to speak only partially Vietnamese, but entirely in war. That night, I promised myself I'd never be wordless when you needed me to speak for you. I began my career as our family's official interpreter. From then on, I would fill in our blanks, our silences, stutters whenever I could. I code switched. I took off our language and wore my English like a mask so that others would see my face and therefore yours. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you. If you guys have any questions, please write them in the chat, and I will read them out for you. And we will be sending out links to the website so you can watch the conversations if you want, and we will also be sending out the references that Marta has been using for her presentation. Yeah, so does anyone have any questions for Marta? They really liked that last passage that you read, Marta.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I really recommend that beautiful novel.
Was that on one of your references or was that a different book?
No, that's it. It's a novel. I can show you.
Yeah,
This is
you can either send it to me later and I'll send it out with all of the other materials.
It's on the reference list. It's Ocean Vuong, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Yeah, the last one.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, I have the Penguin edition. I don't know in the US by whom it was published, but yeah, it's just been published last year, so it should be found easily.
I think we have Penguin books. But yeah, so if you would like to read the Vietnamese novel, it is the last book on the reference sheet. Any other questions? Ah, Julie says it's available on Amazon, so we're good.
Perfect.
All right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. All right. People are saying your thesis was great, so keep going.
Thank you. In the project. Oh, the thesis.
Yeah. Oh, we have a question coming in. Hold on. They're still writing.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank again Jennifer and all of you for this dialogue and this opportunity.
So someone is asking if you could just briefly review the 4 or 5 talks you've already presented with the other cooperators and the relationships of their subjects. So I guess I'll go back to that other page.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please? So review the content of the talks and the relationship, what subjects they're experts in. Is that the
Yeah.
question?
Let me
Yes. So yes.
share my screen. Okay. So I'll go back to the beginning. Here we go.
Yeah, so the first talk with Nicola Gardini was about the language of COVID-19. So the ways in which an unexpected, unknown event puts us in the condition to create, forge, shape a new language. So the way we resort to new words like social distancing and PPE, all sorts of things that probably non-professional were not used to encounter so often. Now they're part of our common everyday language. And also what kind of metaphors we resort to, for instance, war metaphors. We have to defeat this enemy, or we have to protect ourselves against this foreign virus. It's all these kind of metaphors that have been used to make sense of this unknown event. And Nicola Gardini is a professor of Italian comparative literature at Oxford, but he also is a writer and a painter. So it was very precious to have him on the series. So Charles Fosdick, he's professor of French at Liverpool, but he is also a leading academic in translation studies because he leads this big government-funded project called Translating Cultures. So this has been like a many years long monumental project, really, about interconnection between translation and culture in all its sense, in its broader sense, and science is part of culture as well, of course. So Charles Fosdick reflected of different experiences of confinement, isolation that we all went through during the pandemic, but with a special emphasis on vulnerable population. And he pointed out the ways in which translation protects us from isolation because it creates connections between elements that people, can be countries or literatures, whatever, between elements that otherwise are disjointed. With Karen Torben, we basically, who is the professor of East Asian languages at Harvard. So this is the third talk. If you could go up, Jennifer, that would be kind with this. Thank you. So basically, we had a chance to discuss her newly published book with the publisher Brill called Global Healing, Literature, Advocacy, Care. The book was published in spring 2020, so it was very coincidental timing, but also very timely book. It's a complex, rich, and very inspiring book in which many aspects of this integrated model of healing are explored, where questions of environment, health, and well-being are all interrelated and studied through the lens of East Asian literatures, but not only, because it's a global world perspective. So there are examples from Afrikaans literature, Yiddish literature, and many other languages. So it's a beautiful book. So that was about the policy of care and the role of translation in it. So the fourth episode with Eivind Eggebretsen. So Eivind is a scientist. So it's a fourth. If you go up, Jennifer, please. Thank you. So he's a philosopher of science, but also a scientist in its own right at Oslo University, and his work on translation on medical humanities is very cutting edge and very, very rigorous at the same time. And we discuss the crisis, to use like these keywords today, of medical evidence or evidence-based medicine at the time of the coronavirus pandemic. So what is medical evidence? That's also a cultural construct. And what is translational medicine? How laboratory research is translating into clinical practice? That's the definition of translational medicine. How can we use and relate these processes to processes of cultural translation? And the final episode, it was recorded this summer because of delays due to the pandemic. And I dialogued with Kirsten Oster, who is a truly interdisciplinary scholar. She has a background in global health, but also media studies and English literature. And we also discussed a book that she published in 2005 about I think it's in the called Cinematic Prophylaxis, Globalization and Contagion in the Discourse of World Health. It's mentioned in the abstract above the video. So in this book, it was quite a, published in 2005. It was quite a prophetic book because it explained the way in which we in a sense attack the foreign and foreigners when we feel in difficulty, when we feel attacked by the virus themselves. So this stigmatization of the foreign, and she did so by looking at the 20th century cinema, basically, and medical documentaries as well produced in the US. And that was quite interesting because obviously representing the invisible through something that emphasizes the sight, like images and cinema, was of course a paradox and an effort that it has been made during this pandemic, also a translational effort. So hope this is helpful.
All right, and so I've already sort of prepped you for this question. When do you expect to complete the project?
Yes, so the Translating COVID-19 project has been completed. So it started, as I said, as an emergency response in May 2020, and then it ended at the end of this past summer. Translating illness is an ongoing project. As I said, it is developing. I envisage to finish it in 2 years' time, more or less. It will result in the writing of my second monograph, in which I will focus on the experience of poet translators and the role of translation in medical settings. But it is a relatively new project, so that's why it is also difficult to give specific dates.
Great, and I have a comment here. It's interesting that COVID isolated people, but also brought them together in some instances. Of course, language plays a huge role to stay connected. I'm thinking of Afghan and other refugees who had to lock down in several European countries.
Yes, absolutely. There is much work to do in this sense. And as I said, migrants have been, to a certain extent, forgotten because obviously there were other urgent issues to deal with. But I think that the role of translators is also to look at these vulnerable populations and give them a voice.
Great. And do we have any other questions or comments for Marta before we go? I would just like to thank Marta for coming. I know you're very busy. And do you include interpreting in your research?
Well, thank you for this question. I haven't yet. There are so many dimensions of translation that one should consider, and this is certainly one I would like to tackle. So not yet, but I hope to. And, thanks.
All right, great. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your research with us. And thank you for sharing your talks. I think I found your talks on YouTube somehow instead of this lovely website that puts them all together. um, so I will be sharing those links with you all, and I will share her references and the link to this presentation in case you want to rewatch it again. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Marta, for gracing us with your presence.
So much to each one of you for inviting me and for being here. Thank you.
And
Thank you.
yes, if you would like to say something, just know that we're, hold on, let me